Well, here we are at Michael's bookshop in Ramsgate again, and another go at vlogging. The idea here, I think, is to do one of the local history books that we publish. And I'm going to start with an early one which uses a rather strange technique. Looking at this, which I hope we can do. Okay. So I'll zoom in a bit. This is you don't want to see that, you want to see the book. This is a book that you would have used as a guidebook if you'd come to Ramsgate a fairly long time ago. It's a bit of a complex issue, the history of holidays and holiday making in this area, but by the 1830s we really had something that people could see as a holiday. The holidays here came out of a thing called the cure, and started in the 1730s. You went off to your doctor in London, I suppose years before Harley Street actually, and you said, "Oh doctor, I've got the flux," or "Oh doctor, I've got the palsy," and he would have tried bleeding you, and if that didn't work, well, you could have gone back and he'd probably put leeches on, and then he'd have said, "Well, honestly, the best thing is a new cure. You need to go off to the seaside for 6 months or a year, depending on the prescription, I suppose how bad the palsy was or how serious your flux was, and every day you go down onto the beach and you strip all your clothes off, drink a pint of seawater, and the professional dunkers will dunk you under the water, and with some prescriptions this would be dunked until you thrash." And obviously this cured everybody. But the way we see going to the seaside might be a day or two, or perhaps a week, maybe a fortnight. Then when they talked in terms of the cure, they were talking renting a house. Only the very rich could afford a doctor anyway, so they would have rented a house, come down here with all their servants, their horses. There would have been a lot of hangers-on, and out of this developed large rental housing in Thanet, particularly in Ramsgate, really, because Ramsgate up until 1815 had been a training town for officers in the Napoleonic Wars, and they need rental houses just like the people coming for the cure. So there were rental houses already here. But the game changer was really 1815. Suddenly there was no Napoleonic Wars, there was a lot of rental housing, and the first steamboats appeared making their way from Tower Bridge down the Thames. And from about 1820 you could get a reliable steamboat that would take you from London in 4 hours at a reasonable price, and lots of people started to come to the seaside. And so this guide is our attempts at producing a cheap reprint of an 1830 guide. Here's the 1830 guide. I don't know how well you can see the front cover, it's a bit dark. You can see we've got it on the shelf for 150 quid, which is about the going rate, if you can get a copy. And you can see here we are, picturesque pocket companion to Margate, Ramsgate and Broadstairs and parts adjacent. So what actually happens here is that the guide doesn't start in Thanet, but it starts in London. It starts where you're going to get on your steamboat, and as you go on your steamboat down the River Thames, it points out the interesting features on the way. So this is the original. We did quite a lot of work on this to turn the original into something that was the same but different. So here it is in our edition, and we produced this strange shape to make it sustainable. So what I actually did was put one page at the top and one at the bottom all the way through, so that it came out actually slightly bigger than the original guide, the actual pages. And see if I can find these somewhere. Oh, well, it is here. So here you have the same pages, and you can see in terms of clarity, well, our reprint is probably a bit easier on the eye. But the main thing is of course, if you do decide to come down the Thames in a boat and you drop the original over the side, it's £150. If you drop this over the side, it's £6.99. You can come in and get another one. So here we are coming down the Thames, Gravesend and so on, until eventually we get to Margate. The early paddle steamers were very reluctant to go any further than Margate. They somehow seemed to see going round the North Foreland as being something like going round the Cape of Good Hope. I don't think they were very well constructed. I don't think that they were very large, and I think they bounced up and down and made all the passengers sick. So they mostly, in the early days, stopped at Margate. Funnily enough, there was no jetty to begin with at Margate, so there was a tremendous business on carrying people from the paddle steamer in boats on people's backs and their luggage, and various jetties were built, and the new one then, the first one, was Jarvis's jetty, which people seem to be quite proud of, and various jetties appeared in Margate. The last one, which was known as Margate Pier, was washed away in, I think, the 1978 storm, something like that. It was a bit sad really, but we lost a lot of piers in this country in that storm. It wasn't all that long before the paddle steamers made their way round the Foreland, and they stopped on the end of Ramsgate East Pier, where there was a dedicated, well, there still is the remains of a dedicated paddle steamer dock or quay that worked at various levels of the tide, and with constant dredging they could get paddle steamers into Ramsgate at any tide and maintain a viable timetable. I'm afraid there's a chap outside with his diesel engine running. It won't be very long before this is thought to be so antisocial as the particulates are reducing people's lives that it won't happen. But there you have it. So we'll come round a bit. Doesn't say much about Birchington because the collection at Birchington hadn't really got going. Salmerston. Of course, it's a bit out of date as a guide, and you may think, oh well, what would anybody do with a guide of this age? However, a big consideration here is, let us suppose that you decide to research the history of your house and you work out what was happening with your house in the 1830s, if you've got one of the houses in Ramsgate. If you think, say, Wellington Crescent was built out in the 1820s, and so you buy an expensive house, and you do a lot of research, you find out who lived in it, when it was built, what was there before it was built, but unless you actually know what was going on in the town and what it was like, you might just as well have researched a house on the moon. It's relating it to something that happened at the time, and obviously at this time the obelisk is new, so there's quite a bit about the obelisk, but if your house dates from the 1830s, you need to follow it through with an understanding of, oh well, here we go, this is a good example. The neat little theatre at Ramsgate, which was built in the year 1826 by that individual, Mr. Fawcett Saville, was unfortunately destroyed by fire in 1829. But nothing daunted this calamity, by which Mr. Saville suffered severe pecuniary loss, because the building was not insured. That preserving gentleman raised the present structure, which continues to be a source of considerable amusement to visitors of Ramsgate, and which will, we sincerely hope, be productive in increasing gain to its very spirited proprietor. Or there's a piece on the Ramsgate schools. There's a piece on the Albion Hotel, which was one of the big hotels on the seafront. It was demolished for the building of Madeira Walk, and the National Westminster Bank was built there, which is now Pizza Hut. But it's useful. Libraries were very important then. They weren't libraries like the libraries today. These were private libraries, in as much as they weren't funded by the state, and they were very much places that people met socially, where they could sit, write letters, buy stationery, and you could pay to borrow books. Back at that time, most novels were published as three-deckers, so they published as much of the book they could print in one go, which was usually about a third of an average novel, and so you got a 3-volume book, and they were relatively very, very expensive, so borrowing them was really the only way. But of course only the gentry engaged in this. See, here's Eastcliff Lodge. This was where Montefiore lived when he lived in Ramsgate, and this went into council ownership, so of course the council demolished it, as you would expect. We go on here to St Lawrence, even Manston, not much in Manston then, but we've added a few extra pictures to this, but not many. Very little about Broadstairs, because at that time Broadstairs wasn't very much. St Peter's was bigger than Broadstairs, but Broadstairs was starting to develop. Ranelagh Gardens at St Peter's was a major tourist attraction, and I suppose tourists at that time did a lot of outings in some sort of horse and carriage. But anyway, that's some notion of kids guide, and of course we can sell you either the original or the reprint, depending on what you want. The originals are nice in a way, and we don't always have originals of these books in stock. Often you can find one with the help of the internet, but they're never cheap and not really something that you'd be very wise to buy unless you've seen it first. Anyway, that's today's web vlog. I don't know whether I'm getting better or worse at this. Only time will tell. I think camera positioning could be improved. Who knows? Anyway, we'll go back up the bookshop and sort of fade out. I don't quite know why I'm doing this, but you've got to do something or other. And you don't want to zoom in on the floor. See where that takes us to. Oh, we're going back up there somewhere. Anyway, that's it for today.